So good morning. I appreciate everyone for being on the line this morning to talk about vicarious trauma and self-care with us. My name is Heather Herman. I am one of the program specialists with the Tennessee Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence. I have been with the coalition for about 3 years, and part of my area of expertise is trauma-informed care, which includes care not only for the survivors that we work with, but also for staff and caring professionals who work with victims of trauma. So that is what we're going to be talking about this morning, the importance of vicarious trauma and self-care. If you have any questions this morning, or at any point if you would like to, if you need me to explain something or slow down or anything like that, please don't hesitate to enter that in your chat or question box, and I will take questions throughout the presentation this morning. I will also be sending out copies of the PowerPoint along with certificates to everyone who attends. Typically, we ask that you all download the certificates in our handouts page, but we weren't able to get those uploaded this time, so I will be sending out an email to all attendees at the end of our presentation today with certificates. So today we're going to talk about vicarious trauma, its symptoms, and the effects that it has on advocates and others in victim service fields. And we are going to talk about ways that we can plan to and personally. So that's our plan for this morning. So Judith Herman writes that supporting people who are survivors of trauma can be immensely rewarding. Providers who do trauma work report appreciating life more fully, taking life more seriously, having a greater scope of understanding of others and themselves, forming new friendships and deeper intimate relationships, and feeling inspired by the daily examples of survivors' courage, determination, and hope. So I do want to start off saying that it's not all bad. While there is the very real risk of vicarious trauma and burnout within any victim service field, there are great benefits to doing this type of work and to having this type of view and on life and this type of chance to do work that is life-changing for others. So it's not all bad. Start off on a positive note this morning. But we all do know that as people who work in this field, as people who work directly with survivors and victims of trauma, that it can often feel like we have so much to do and so many places to go and such a huge workload to get done all the time that the only bit of time that we may have for self-care or stress reduction are moments where we feel like we are banging our head against a wall, or that we feel like we are at that breaking point where we have no choice but to slow down and we don't get to do those preventative things that we would like to do to keep ahead of that feeling of being overwhelmed. And so part of that is that the work we do is demanding, and it requires a unique relationship between ourselves and the client, even with the most healthy of boundaries from an advocate. You still have to hear the client's stories. You still have to work very closely with them on their goals and on helping them to heal and respond to the trauma that they've experienced. So you do have a very unique view into the trauma that has happened in their lives, which is different than someone who may just work with people in a capacity where they see them for only a moment, or who work in retail or different things like that, where we're not forming those types of one-on-one relationships with the people that you work with. And trauma work both necessitates absorbing and then revisiting painful issues. So we're hearing these stories, and we may be hearing these stories repeatedly, and many people who get involved in victim services fields do so because they have had personal experience with some type of trauma, whether they themselves are survivors or whether they've seen close friends or loved ones deal with trauma. Many of us are in this field because of those personal moments. So hearing survivor stories can often necessitate revisiting those moments from our own lives, and that requires a lot of vulnerability and a lot of empathy, which even for the most extroverted among us is very tiring and very difficult to maintain that level of energy and engagement and empathy with our clients day in and day out over great periods of time. So all of these things are unique to trauma work, are unique to victim services, and are emotionally very draining for those of us who work in the field. And so part of what happens when we work with victims and survivors of trauma is we experience what is called a trauma exposure response. And put it simply, trauma exposure response refers to this transformation that takes place inside of us as a result of our exposure to the suffering of other people. And it's the way in which the world looks and feels like a different place because of the work that we do. Obviously, I have a bit of a lighthearted example, the Oreo dunking technique, and this changes everything, but it's the way in which we look at and experience the world differently because of our exposure and understanding of the trauma that others experience. For example, you may be less trusting of people than you were before you began doing trauma work. You may be more cautious. You may be more fearful about interacting with people in the public. I've worked with a lot of individuals who are victim service professionals and advocates who are also parents, who find it incredibly difficult to let their kids do things like go to slumber parties and stay at friends' houses overnight, just because they've been exposed to the worst of what can happen in the world, and so you get a bit jaded. And this is what trauma exposure response is. So when a person's frame of reference is disturbed, their beliefs about other people and the world are affected, and it may become difficult to retain that same sense of hope and optimism and belief in the goodness around us. And so it affects our sense of self, our worldview. It sometimes can affect our personal relationships because we start seeing signs of and red flags for abusive behaviors in people that we meet who we may otherwise, in the past have become great friends with, and now we are more tuned into these signs of behaviors and we're getting a little more jaded. And so the important thing, or one of the most important things to remember about trauma exposure response, is that it is a reality. It happens to virtually everyone who is part of the victim services field, and everyone who works with survivors of trauma. And it, in and of itself, is not a bad thing. It sort of is what it is. We are exposed to these traumas, and therefore it does affect how we see and how we experience the world. But what can be bad and what can more negatively affect us in the long run is if we are not doing things to care for ourselves in response to these changes within us. And so that's where we get things like vicarious trauma and burnout, which we're going to kind of talk about as we move forward here. So here's a good example of trauma exposure response, and this is from someone who works as an advocate for trauma victims. And it says, I think you see the worst of people working here, the worst of what people do to each other. I think that when you don't have proper resources to process that, to work through it, to understand it or put it in some kind of context, it leaves you feeling a little baffled about what's going on out there and the ways things work in the world and your role in all of that. So this is a great example of what trauma exposure response means in practice. You're seeing the worst of humanity or the worst things that people do to each other, and it leaves you a little at a loss because you're understanding that there is darkness in the world. And so, but the quote also says that having proper resources to process it and works through it and put it in context can help mitigate a lot of these effects. And so that's part of planning for our self-care, is having ways to process and work through and work out these feelings and emotions that we're dealing with and struggling with because of our exposure to trauma. So, exposure to others' trauma doubles the risk that social workers or other helping professionals will experience post-traumatic stress disorder. While the rate of secondary trauma among these people is high, their awareness of trauma's effect on them is low. And I think part of that is that it's hard for us as helpers to admit that we're having these kinds of effects from the trauma that we are seeing and experiencing through our clients. We may feel guilty about struggling, and guilty about complaining or feeling these emotions when we are not the ones that are being directly impacted by the trauma or directly experiencing the trauma. We're experiencing it secondhand through our clients, so we may have a lot of guilt around our own feelings of distress because we are here to help people who are dealing with trauma. We're here to be the helpers. We're here to be the champions. We're here to be the advocates. And we may view this as either a sign of weakness or a sign that we are not doing our job correctly. When the reality is this exposure to trauma and this secondary and vicarious trauma exposure happens to all of us, and it's normal. And what is not normal and what is a cause for concern is when we deny it and we allow it to fester and grow and become a barrier to normal, healthy, happy experience and function in our lives. Sorry, my anxiety made you anxious about my anxiety. often many of the people that we work with within our organizations, we're all experiencing vicarious trauma, trauma exposure response, compassion fatigue. We're experiencing the effects of trauma from one degree to another. And so if we are collectively not engaging in self-care and not engaging in those preventative methods of managing that trauma, we can really feed on the anxiety and the tension that our colleagues and our peers are experiencing. So we are feeding into each other, and we can be making it worse for us as an organization because we are collectively not caring for ourselves. And so when you work closely with individuals, as we often do in this field, because many of us have very small staffs and very tight-knit groups who have to really engage with each other to do this work, if I'm feeling anxious and you're feeling anxious, and then we're feeding off each other's anxiety, and there's no one who can be the voice of reason in the room, we're ratcheting that up and up and up throughout our days. So as an organization, as a community, as a whole, we're making it worse for each other by not caring for ourselves. So defining some of these terms that I'm throwing around. Vicarious trauma is this idea that I still care, but I'm suffering too. This is the cumulative, transformative effect on the helper of working with survivors of traumatic life events. So vicarious trauma is something that we all experience as first responders, as victim advocates, as helpers in a helping profession. It's this negative transformation in the helper that results from being empathetic and using our empathy and opening ourselves up to the vulnerability of caring and feeling intensely the stories that we're hearing. And so this is, again, something that virtually everyone within this field experiences to one degree or another. The key is, how are we handling it? How are we healing it? How are we mitigating it so that we can still do our work and that we are still healthy in our work? And so it's like that we are carrying the weight of the world. We often feel that we are carrying this heavy burden of the stories and the people that we work with every day. So signs of vicarious trauma include, but are not limited to, things like feeling helpless, feeling like you can never do enough and you're constantly on the go, hypervigilance, diminished creativity, just trying to get through your day and follow the same path, and it can feel like being kind of in a rut. Minimizing, chronic exhaustion, being tired all the time, deliberately avoiding things that you know will be upsetting, dissociative moments, so that staring off into space and just sort of checking out. The sense of persecution, it's always me, it's always my job, I can't do enough and nobody else helps me. Guilt, the inability to empathize, so you use up so much of your empathy and so much of your emotional capacity that you sort of run out of the ability to draw in any more of these stories, and you lose that ability to empathize. Addictions, and it doesn't have to be drugs or alcohol, although that can be the case. It could be nicotine, It can be coffee, those types of things. So all of these are signs of vicarious trauma, and if you will recognize them, many of these are also signs and symptoms of trauma response in general. We see a lot of these same parallel symptoms within the clients that we work with, and there's a reason for that, because you are being affected by trauma that may not be trauma that you are experiencing directly, but it is trauma nonetheless. So sometimes after a session, I will be traumatized. I will feel overwhelmed and can remember a particular situation with a sexually abused person where I just didn't want to hear any more of her stories. She seemed to want to continue telling me those, and I remember just feeling almost contaminated. So this is a great example of vicarious trauma, and that idea that I can't, that, that wearing out or wearing down of our ability to empathize, and that this idea that I can't absorb anymore. And there's a wonderful quote that I think sums this up, which is, you have to refill your own wells in order to continue to be able to pour out into others. So if you are letting yourself run dry, you can no longer share your compassion and your empathy and your wisdom with the people that you are meant to be working with. So compassion fatigue is kind of this next level, this idea of I still care, but I need a break. I'm really hitting a wall. I'm really hitting that point where I cannot keep carrying the burden of trauma and empathy. And so instead of carrying the weight of the world, we feel a little crushed under the weight of the world. Our capacity to react or take appropriate interest is compromised. Our capacity to absorb and empathize with the trauma of others is compromised. And so research with victim service providers finds that the responses that we have to vicarious and secondary trauma and compassion fatigue parallel victims and survivors' adaptations, including these common, as I said, post-traumatic stress symptoms, avoidance, numbing, aggression, difficult boundary management, and generally just stress, anxiety, depression. All of those things are going to be exacerbated. They're getting worse because we are not caring for ourselves. So signs of compassion fatigue include disturbances in our frame of reference, that really extreme trauma exposure response, lowering of self-capacity, so we are not taking care of our most basic needs, eating, sleeping, our most basic relational needs, spending time with friends and family. We may feel like we can't spend time with friends and family because we are so overwhelmed with trauma that we are afraid that we are going to burden them with the stress that we're feeling. And lack of ego resources, so that ability to self-monitor, that ability to empathize and to be present and to engage with others equally and not be completely self-focused. And a lot of this may come from this idea of expectation versus reality. And the idea that what we thought we were going to be doing when we entered this work is different than what we are doing day in and day out. So things like there's so much paperwork and there's red tape and there's not enough money, and we want to help survivors, but there's not enough housing and there aren't enough staff. And so all of these things become greater burdens that we have to mitigate, and we have to find ways around that pull us away from moments of truly helping survivors. And so those small things can pile up and feel like a much greater burden over time because with this compassion fatigue, it's lowering our ability to manage these day-to-day stresses. And so every little thing feels like a much greater burden and a much greater problem than it normally would. And then there's burnout. And burnout is, I don't want to carry the weight at all. I want to just get rid of it. I never want to see it again. I don't care anymore. I'm past the point of being able to care about others because I am in such great need and such great pain. And burnout is sort of, it's the gap between what we need to do our jobs and what we are able to do. And we can no longer meet in the middle because we have used up our capacity to help to such a degree that we are struggling and we are suffering. And so you have things like complete emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, so even beyond difficulty empathizing to downright negative attitudes towards clients, detachment from the mission and the agency, loss of ideals. I don't even care that I am helping people anymore. I'm so done. Reduced feeling of accomplishment. Even as you help people, you're no longer feeling that success because you're so far removed from the moment. And so we have lost the capacity to care. And so a lot of things go along with burnout. Your work may begin to suffer from reduced productivity, reduced motivation, lower self-esteem, increased absenteeism, increased sick days. You're out more and more and more, feeling inadequate about your ability to help, experiencing intrusive thoughts or nightmares that are related to your work. So even when you're home, even when you're away, you're still experiencing stress and you're still focused on all of these professional things that are weighing you down. It can heighten your sense of personal vulnerability, causes you to become more afraid of other people in general, more distrustful even in close relationships, increasingly cynical to higher and higher degrees. You may experience witness guilt or survivor's guilt for the fact that you have been spared from suffering what the people that you're working with have endured. You may feel anger and disgust toward the survivors and people that you're meant to serve because they don't respond in the ideal ways that you wish that they would, or that you think that you would respond in their shoes, so that your frustration turns into these really negative, angry emotions. And there's a breakdown of good boundaries because you're unable to hold that work and home boundary or that professional and personal boundary. So all of these things can be happening with someone who's experiencing burnout. And the problem with burnout is it's kind of a point of no return. unfortunately. So you'll see from this little chart, it's a very simplistic way to look at it, but you'll see here, you start in this area, our work with victims of trauma, and our trauma exposure response here, that greater awareness of traumatic events in the world, we're using our empathy. And because of this, we have symptoms of vicarious trauma, which is normal, which, as we said, happens to almost everyone in the field. And at this point, if you intervene with your self-care, then it mitigates that response. It brings us back to full empathy and full ability to do our job. It mitigates our response, our trauma exposure response, and our trauma symptoms. But if we don't intervene and we don't engage in self-care, we're continuing to use our empathy and continuing to be exposed to trauma without caring for ourselves, without refilling our wells. And as the cycle repeats, empathy lessens over time. And so again, you can still put some self-care in here. You can still mitigate and heal those symptoms, but if you're continuing down this path without any care, once you hit burnout, there's nowhere else to go. You're hitting a stop button here, because what we understand about burnout and the research behind it is that once you hit that point, really the only thing that can help you heal and start to mitigate those symptoms are large life changes, career changes, taking long sabbaticals. So the last thing that we want, we being the coalition, or we being your supervisors or your community or the victims you serve, the last thing that we want is for you to hit that wall of burnout, because we know that there are already too few people who are advocates in this field. There are already too few people who are engaging in this work, and we don't want to lose that wonderful impact that you have on the world. But once you hit that wall of burnout, there's not a lot that we can do to mitigate the effects other than saying, I can no longer do this work. So, and again, once you've hit that wall of burnout, we are stubborn people in this field, and we don't like to admit that we are having these issues. We don't like to admit that we need help, because we feel like all of our resources and all of our help and all of our energy should be focused on helping other people. And when we see our coworkers and our peers dealing with these emotions, anxiety and vicarious trauma symptoms, we want to help them, but we often don't extend that same grace to ourselves. So, reframing our approach to trauma work and how we think about what we're doing. The most important part is to acknowledge that it will affect you, that it is normal to be affected, that it is normal to deal with vicarious trauma, that it is normal to deal with trauma exposure response. And once we understand that it's normal, then we understand that caring for ourselves and caring for these trauma symptoms is also a normal part of doing our job. I found that my wounds begin to heal when the voices of those endangered by silence are given power. The gift of light in our compassion, our listening, our work, is the gift of life to ourselves. So in order to keep experiencing the wonder that is being able to help people heal and move on from trauma and being able to prevent and work against a culture that normalizes violence, to be able to be an advocate, an activist, an ally within this field, we have to give ourselves that same light, that same compassion, that same grace that we would give to others. And so that starts with understanding where our stress is coming from and engaging in ways that we can start healing and caring for those emotional wounds. I have come to believe that caring for myself is not self-indulgent. Caring for myself is an act of survival. So understanding and embracing that there's nothing wrong with caring for ourselves, and in fact, caring for ourselves allows us to continue our good work with our clients. So, things to remember: an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, especially in the case of vicarious trauma and burnout. If you prevent and you engage in self-care periodically, whether you feel like you need it or not, whether you feel like you're experiencing trauma symptoms or not, you're going to keep yourself from getting to the point where you hit that wall. Remembering that even staff who don't come into direct contact with clients, so people like people who work more on the financial or administrative side of our organizations, can still be affected by the stories, because because a large part of the culture of many of our organizations is sharing the stories and impact of trauma that we see from the survivors that come through our doors. So these people who may not be part of our direct service team can still have these trauma responses. So, some things to think about in terms of prevention. Maintain and communicate healthy boundaries between victims and advocates. So things like never giving out your personal cell phone number to clients, not answering the phone after hours, not answering emails after hours unless you're on call, being at work when you're at work, and being at home when you're at home. So I encourage all of you, if you can, to not have your work email come to your phone, or to not have work calls come to your phone. And I know that it's not always possible, and that some of us are on call, and especially if we are executive directors or higher up in the organization, it's more difficult. But putting that healthy boundary between your work life and your home life, and making sure that you are keeping to those boundaries, and at the very least, when we are on vacation, when we're truly taking that personal time, we should not be engaging in work activities. Find the satisfactory level of stress you require in order to thrive. So everyone, a little bit of healthy stress is not a bad thing, but understanding what those healthy levels are for yourself. Develop a stress management plan. Schedule yourself mental health days. Use your personal time, use your time off, use your sick days. When you are sick, take sick days. Sounds simple, but many of us don't do it. Recognize the symptoms and signs of stress and compassion fatigue so that you can be sure to engage in self-care and start mitigating those experiences. And for a lot of us, as I said, who feel guilty about engaging in self-care, for those of us who feel like it may be a bad thing, think about it this way. Does your decision to engage in self-care hurt anyone? Is your decision to engage in self-care morally wrong? And are you likely to regret the decision to engage in self-care down the road? And 99% of the time, the answer to those questions are going to be no. And that means that you have every right to care for yourself, to nurture yourself just like you would with a client or with someone that you care about in your life. And so there are a lot of realms of our lives or areas of our lives where we can start thinking about self-care and the ways that we can, the ways that people engage in and indulge in self-care are different from everyone. Some people are really engaged with and really enjoy doing things that let them indulge in their creativity, whether that's writing or painting or drawing or coloring, any of those sort of things. So you might explore the creative side. Some people love to cook and eat and indulge in those kinds of things. Some people love a nice relaxing, a nap or a day at the spa or a massage, movement, exercise, yoga, going for a walk, getting outside, having a treat that you love. Self-care feels different for everyone. Some people may think that reading a book feels like a chore or feels boring to them, and for some people that may be an incredible relaxing indulgence. So find those things that speak to you and feel good to you. And self-care doesn't have to be getting a massage or meditating. Self-care can be rock climbing. Self-care can be going to a concert. Self-care can be watching your favorite TV show or going to a movie. Anything that makes you feel good and engaged and relaxed and energized. Those things that heal you are going to be individual to you and may not be the same things that heal me or heal someone else. So the other thing that we need to start thinking about is not only prevention but coping skills, these things that we can do when we are feeling that stress and when we are feeling the effects of that vicarious trauma. And that can include things like distractions, absorbing your mind in something else, radio, TV, puzzles, reading, games, going to a concert, doing something creative, all of those things to get your mind off of it, give your mind a break. And this, it's not prevention. It doesn't resolve the underlying issues that are causing you stress, but it is a great way to manage or to mitigate a little bit of that stress that can be ongoing. Grounding, so really taking a serious moment to focus on your body and the world around you. This can be meditation, prayer, going for a walk, mindfulness exercises, breathing exercises, anything that gets you in touch with your body, so exercise, movement, yoga. These are really good tools to combat anxiety, to combat flashbacks and trauma symptoms. And it helps to slow or stop those moments of dissociation. So things like using your senses to point out things that may be in the room with you. So taking a moment to breathe and saying, what are 5 things that I can see in this room? What are 5 things that I can hear in this room? Anything that gets you into that moment and reminds you that you are present in your body is a great way to stop or slow dissociation. Affirmations. reminding yourself that you matter, reminding yourself that the things that you have to offer to the world matters, reminding yourself that the work that you do is good and important, and reminding yourself that you have a lot to offer to your clients, to your organization, to your loved ones, to yourself. So having those little affirmations to remind yourself throughout the day. Maybe putting a little post-it note on your computer or your mirror, something that you'll see often. Emotional releases, so playing loud music, singing, yelling, popping balloons, something that lets you laugh or lets you cry. So releasing a rush of emotion in whatever way that looks for you is a good way to release intense emotions. If you have, a day where you hear a really particularly difficult story, or you have something really frustrating that happens, or a setback with a client or a personal issue, doing one of these quick emotional releases is great in that moment. But it's obviously hard to do in some situations. You can't really yell in your office, but maybe you can go get in your car and drive around the block and do this. So thinking about those instantaneous things that you can do. We also want to really think about not only things that we can do personally as individuals, but organizational policies and organizational cultures of self-care. Because there are a lot of things in this field that are really risk factors or red flags that can increase vicarious trauma and burnout that come directly from the cultures of our organization. So things like risk factors can include things like unrealistic expectations, the pressure to have really large caseloads or accomplish goals in really short and unrealistic timelines, top-down management style where supervisors really question and invalidate lower staff's knowledge and skills and invalidate self-care attempts and don't, management and the top tiers of an organization need to really model self-care for those below them, because if you see that your supervisor or your executive director doesn't take lunch or eats at their desk or doesn't take time off when they're sick or answers their emails or sends out emails while they're at home off the clock or doesn't take vacation days or whatever it may be, seeing that the people high up in your organization engage in those practices makes it feel like an organizational culture, like you are expected, that you and everyone else are expected to engage in those same unhealthy boundaries. So if you see your supervisor eating lunch at his or her desk and not taking an appropriate lunch, you may feel like you are expected to do that same thing. Or if you get emails from your supervisor on a Friday night or a Saturday, you may feel like you're expected to answer those emails on a Friday night or a Saturday when you're supposed to be off. So modeling those healthy behaviors. Inappropriate demands. So short-staffed agencies might pressure advocates to do things like forego breaks, forego vacation days, work double shifts, work longer hours, and overload staff. Workplace bullying, not providing training and personal development, not providing adequate vacation or adequate personal leave and wellness things within the organization can all be big risk factors that you really want to think about when considering whether you have a healthy organizational culture that promotes care. And there are ways that you can promote self-care within your organization, and there are ways that and policies that you can implement. Providing staff training on vicarious trauma and burnout and self-care, addressing issues of trauma in a non-judgmental way, empathize that, staff are not to blame for vicarious trauma, emphasize that trauma response is normal and it's expected, and emphasize that we are expected to care for ourselves, that part of doing this work is engaging in self-care. Providing supervision and consultation and opportunities to debrief and talk out things that happen throughout our day. Paying attention to people's training needs and personal development and giving opportunities for that personal growth within an organization, whether that means attending trainings and conferences or webinars or whatever that looks like, making sure that that's built into your organization. If possible, limiting sizes of caseloads so that advocates and therapists and social workers and case managers, they're not feeling like they're so overwhelmed with the volume of people that they have to work with. And if you've attended any of the recent in-person trainings that the coalition has put on, we're hearing a lot from grant managers, from the coalition, from OCJP, from these other organizations that provide grant funding to shelters and crisis centers, that we want you all to understand that we care more about the quality of the services that you're providing versus the quantity of services that you're providing. And we would rather you serve 10 people and serve them fully and holistically and completely and serve them incredibly well than 10,000 people who barely get any services because you're so overwhelmed with this volume. So trying to the best of our ability to make sure that caseloads are manageable. That way we can be really giving good care to every person who comes through our door and not dropping the ball on the care of individuals. And creating policies that encourage self-care, policies that encourage taking time and wellness and respectful working environments. All of these things are incredibly important. So things like lunch and learns, or once a month staff yoga or meditation, or any of these small things that you can do to encourage, build in 10-minute self-care breaks into every shift, or 30 minutes, or however you can add that into your day. So really encourage those kinds of things within your organization. So I really like this quote. You need a supervisor who, if you're not taking care of yourself, instead of saying, good job for pushing through and filling out all those papers, will say, you've done a good job and in fact you're exemplary, but we're worried about your longevity because you haven't taken any vacation. It's time for you to take some vacation. Because understanding that no matter how great of work someone seems to be doing, that if they're overworking and overstressing themselves and not taking care, that you're really looking at someone who may experience burnout, and then your organization is going to lose them and lose that good work that they were doing. So, I just want to end on some little ideas of small ways that you can take care of yourself. So, listen to your favorite song, have a snack, make sure that you have pictures of your family and loved ones in your office so you can see them throughout your day. Look at a video of cute cats on YouTube. Take 5 minutes out of your day to look at a cute animal video and make yourself smile. Something simple like that. Think about how to engage different aspects of yourself within self-care. So mind, body, and spirit. Things like learning and meditation and music and exercise and sleeping enough, which almost none of us get enough sleep, and self-reflection. And if you are someone who prays, prayer. If you are someone who likes to read, if you are someone who likes to meditate, whatever those things are for you, think of the different realms in your life and how you can engage yourself in self-care. And again, put in those moments throughout your day. If you have 5 minutes between clients, take that 5 minutes to watch a cute video or make yourself a cup of tea or listen to a song that you like or stretch, do like a little stretching exercise in your office or whatever that is to pull yourself out of your work for just a minute or two, and let yourself kind of decompress and take a deep breath before you move on to the next thing. So your life does not get better by chance, it gets better by change. So we have to be proactive around these issues of care and wellness. Does anybody have any questions about what we've gone over today? We've talked a lot. I've talked a lot. You've hopefully listened a lot. So does anybody have any questions before we end? And again, if you do have questions, please type them in your chat box so I can see them. All right. Well, it does not appear that anyone has questions. There are a lot of resources that I have, and again, I will be emailing you all this this PowerPoint as well as your certificate of attendance, so you will receive all of those wonderful resources. You don't have to worry. And if you do think of any questions or any resources that you would like or any issues that you're having, please don't hesitate to email me. Get in touch. That's what I'm here for. I'm so very happy to help in any way that I can. I just want to thank you all for attending today. It was my pleasure to chat with you about self-care. And once again, I will be sending out all of these resources to you, so please don't feel like worried that you won't get them or you didn't get to copy everything down. And again, this webinar was recorded, so it will be up so you can share with your staff or check back later. But again, thank you everyone for attending, and I hope to see you or speak to you soon. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful holiday.